The first strike came without warning. One moment the stars outside the station glowed like quiet candles, and the next, alarms shrieked as enemy ships tore through the void. Metal corridors rattled. Fire streaked across the hangar. People ran in panic. In the middle of all this chaos stood a human soldier, one of the few on board, pulling others to safety when the bulkheads slammed shut. He wasn't supposed to be here. He was just a technical advisor, a man who knew engines better than weapons. But when war arrived, he found himself standing where soldiers fell. The alien forces that attacked were ruthless, their ships cutting through defenses with precise strikes. Inside the station, squads scrambled, each trying to defend their post. Amid the chaos, the human spotted her, the alien officer who had refused to even glance at him in earlier meetings. She was tall, her silver armor gleaming even through smoke, her pale braids swinging as she shouted orders. She had the kind of presence that made everyone stop and listen. But she was also pinned, cornered by a falling beam that cut her off from her squad. Without thinking, the human sprinted forward. Ignoring the burning sparks that fell across his face, he pushed against the beam with everything he had. Muscles screamed. Heat burned his palms through the gloves. For a second it felt impossible, until he heard her voice, sharp but desperate, telling him to stop. "Human, you'll be crushed," she shouted. He gritted his teeth and forced it upward just enough for her to slip out. When she stumbled free, her silver blue eyes locked on him, wide with disbelief. No one had dared risk themselves for her before, not like this. They both crouched as another explosion shook the floor. She tried to regain command of her troops, barking orders into her come, but her voice faltered when she looked at him again. She didn't understand why he had acted so recklessly. To her people, every action was calculated, every life measured in worth. Yet this human had nearly broken himself for someone who had only ever treated him coldly. They fought their way down the corridor together, side by side, weapons firing at advancing attackers. He wasn't trained like her, but he had courage, and that made every shot count. When they finally reached a sealed command room, the heavy doors locked behind them, leaving only the two of them in the dim glow of failing lights. The sounds of battle echoed beyond the walls, but in that moment, there was silence between them. She turned, her chest rising and falling from the fight, her braid loosened, strands falling across her face. She studied him as if seeing him for the first time, as though she was searching for the reason behind his actions. He gave a half smile, exhausted yet alive, and said something simple without thinking, words that slipped out before he realized the weight they carried. "You look incredible when you fight." For a moment she froze. Her eyes widened, and her lips parted, not with anger but with something else. No one had ever spoken to her like that. To her people, she was a commander, a figure of duty, not someone to be admired or cherished. The compliment landed harder than any enemy strike. Her hands trembled against the edge of her armor, and she looked away as if trying to hide it. He thought maybe he had offended her. Maybe it was wrong to say such words in the middle of war. But then she whispered, so soft he almost didn't hear it over the alarms, "Repeat those words, human." Her voice carried no command this time, no authority. It was fragile, like a secret begging not to be lost. He saw her differently, now not just as the untouchable alien officer, but as someone who carried the weight of an entire crew. A woman who had forgotten what it felt like to be seen as more than a soldier. The walls shook again. Lights flickered, and the war outside roared louder. But inside that room, everything slowed. He stared at her, realizing that his careless compliment had broken through something no weapon ever could. The command room trembled as another impact shook the outer hull. Sirens blared, red lights flashing across the walls, but the human could only focus on her. The alien officer's words lingered in the air, fragile yet heavy, like they did not belong in a war zone. He had expected anger. maybe even a threat for daring to speak so boldly, but instead, she had whispered as if she needed those words more than the air in her lungs. He hesitated, unsure if repeating them would insult her or comfort her. Yet her eyes, bright and unsteady, told him the truth. They weren't the eyes of a commander at that moment, but of a woman who had carried too much for too long. So he spoke again, softer this time, as if the universe itself might break the moment if he spoke too loud. "You look incredible when you fight." She inhaled sharply, as though the words pierced her deeper than any blade. Her shoulders quivered beneath her silver armor. For years, she had lived behind steel walls of discipline and command, never letting anyone close. Her people only ever praised her tactics, her victories, her ruthlessness. But this was different. This human had seen her not as a tool of war, but as someone worth admiring. Before she could answer, the thumb on her wrist buzzed with static. Reports of the station's failing defenses filled the channel. The enemy was breaking through faster than expected. She snapped back into command mode, issuing quick orders to regroup what forces remained. Yet even as her voice grew steady again, her gaze lingered on him. They pushed open a maintenance hatch to escape the sealed chamber, climbing into the narrow service tunnels that ran beneath the station. It was dark, filled with smoke and the faint hum of power conduits. She led the way, her braid swaying, her weapon ready, but he noticed how often she glanced back to check if he was still behind her. She had never done that before. At one junction, the tunnel split, one path leading toward the armory and the other toward the med bay. She hesitated, torn between duty and survival. He saw the conflict on her face and spoke firmly. "We go where you need us most. You're not alone in this." Her lips pressed into a thin line, and for a moment she seemed ready to argue. But then she simply nodded, choosing the armory. They moved quickly, dodging falling sparks and the groan of straining metal. When they reached the armory, it was half destroyed, but enough remained for them to rearm. He strapped on reinforced plating that barely fit him and loaded a rifle that hummed with alien energy. She watched him clumsily handle the weapon, then stepped closer, her hands brushing against his as she adjusted his grip. Her touch was brief, professional, yet he felt the heat of it travel through the armor. Their eyes met again. This time she didn't look away. "You are reckless," she murmured, her voice low. "And foolish. But perhaps not weak." He smirked, a trace of humor in his eyes. "I'll take that as a compliment." For the first time since he had known her, a hint of a smile touched her lips. It was faint, almost hidden, but it was there, softening the edges of the warrior she had always shown the world. The moment shattered when the bulkhead at the far end of the armory exploded inward. Enemy soldiers stormed in, weapons blazing. Together they fought, shoulder to shoulder, the human firing bursts of energy while she struck with precision. At one point, when an enemy blade slashed toward him, she spun and intercepted the strike, her own weapon flaring. Her braid whipped across his face as she pulled him back. After the last of their attackers fell, the armory lay in ruin, smoke curling through the broken walls. She stood close, her breathing heavy, armor scorched. He looked at her again, unable to stop himself. "You're more than incredible when you fight. You're unstoppable." This time she didn't tremble. She closed her eyes, almost as if savoring the sound of his words, then whispered back, "Do not stop saying such things, human. Not while this war still tries to take everything from us." In that moment, amid fire and ruin, he realized he had become something more than an outsider. To her, his words were strength, and perhaps even hope. The smoke had barely cleared when they slipped back into the narrow tunnels, leaving the wrecked armory behind. The human followed close behind her, his weapon still warm from the last battle. Every step echoed with urgency, yet the silence between them carried something heavier than fear. She didn't speak at first, but he could feel her awareness of him with every glance over her shoulder. Every time she slowed her pace to make sure he kept up. As they climbed through a hatch, they emerged into a larger corridor. Fires licked the walls, debris scattered across the floor. The sounds of distant fighting roared through the air. Her comm crackled again, reports of collapsing shields, more enemies breaching the station. She clenched her jaw, the weight of command pressing down on her shoulders. She barked orders into the channel, her voice firm, yet the tremor beneath it betrayed the truth. She was leading what was left of her people through fire and death, and for the first time in years she felt the ground slipping away. But then, his voice cut through her thoughts. Calm, human, steady. You're not alone. You're leading, yes, but you're not carrying this fight by yourself. Not while I'm here. Her steps faltered. She turned slightly, her braid brushing against her cheek, and studied him. She wanted to snap back, to tell him his words were naive. But instead, she found herself wanting to believe him. They pressed forward until they reached a sealed medical wing. Inside, the air was thick with smoke and the faint glow of dying lights. Several injured soldiers lay against the walls, some conscious, others barely holding on. The human immediately dropped to his knees, tending to the nearest one. He wasn't a doctor, but his hands were steady, his voice calm as he reassured them. She stood watching, frozen for a moment. This human had fought by her side without hesitation, and now, without being ordered, he gave what little strength he had to comfort the wounded. Something shifted inside her. She stepped forward, crouched beside him, and together they worked to stabilize the injured. One soldier, bloodied but alive, looked at them both with wide eyes. The commander and the human, he whispered weakly. Maybe we still have a chance. Her chest tightened at those words. She had never realized how closely her people watched her. They didn't see her as fragile, but they also didn't see her as a woman. They saw only the untouchable warrior. And yet, when the human glanced at her with that same quiet admiration, she felt something stir that she hadn't allowed in years. When the last wounded soldier was secured, they prepared to move again. As she adjusted her weapon, she caught him watching her. Not with fear, not with the distance her own soldiers kept, but with an openness that disarmed her. She felt heat rise to her cheeks, a strange, alien warmth she didn't understand. Why do you keep looking at me like that? She demanded, though her voice lacked its usual sharpness. He shrugged, a small smile tugging at his lips. Because even here, with everything falling apart, you carry yourself like someone the universe should listen to. You're remarkable. Her chest tightened. She turned away quickly, afraid he would see her expression crack. For years she had built walls higher than steel, but now with only a few words, he had found a way through. She whispered so low, it was almost lost to the roar of distant explosions. Say it again, human. Before I forget what it feels like. The corridor shuddered as another blast rocked the station, forcing them onward. They guided the wounded through hidden passages until they reached a docking bay, half destroyed, but still holding several damaged shuttles. She ordered her soldiers to prepare for evacuation. Yet as she watched them work, her thoughts kept drifting back to the human at her side. His presence steadied her in ways she could not admit. When a group of enemy warriors stormed the hangar, the human was the first to react. He leapt in front of the wounded, firing wildly, reckless but fearless. She joined him instantly, their movements syncing in a rhythm that felt unplanned yet perfect. Side by side, they fought with a bond unspoken, their backs protecting the other without needing words. When the last enemy fell, the hangar was littered with bodies and smoke. The human slumped against a pillar, breathing hard, blood seeping from a cut on his shoulder. She rushed to his side, her armored hand pressing against the wound. Their faces were close now, the flickering lights casting shadows across his features. You could have died, she said sharply, though her voice cracked at the edges. He grinned faintly despite the pain. But I didn't. Not while you're here. Her eyes searched his. And for the first time in her life, she felt something more terrifying than war hope mixed with fear, tangled with something her people had never allowed her to show. She whispered again, trembling, "Say it again, human." And he did. The wounded soldiers were loaded onto the battered shuttles, their engines sputtering with unstable power. She stood at the edge of the docking bay, giving orders with her usual steady tone, but inside her chest, a storm churned. She had spent her life being the strongest, the one her people looked to in times of despair. Now, she found herself looking at him, the human who had risked himself over and over for her, without hesitation. As the last shuttle lifted, she turned to him. He was sitting on a crate, wrapping the wound on his shoulder with torn fabric. His movements were clumsy but determined. When she approached, he looked up with that same maddening half-smile, the one that made her heartbeat stumble. She knelt beside him and pulled the fabric away. "You will bleed out if you do this without care," she muttered. Taking over, her hands were practiced and precise, but she noticed how close they were. How his eyes didn't flinch away from hers like everyone else's did. He watched her as if she was not just a commander, but someone worth noticing. That gaze made her fingers tremble, though she tried to hide it. When she tightened the bandage, he hissed in pain, then chuckled softly. "You know, you're gentler than you look." Her eyes widened. No one had ever dared to describe her that way. Gentleness was weakness to her people. But in his voice, it wasn't an insult, it was something he cherished. She froze, her hand still on his shoulder, before whispering under her breath, "Say that again." Before he could, the blast doors thundered open. Enemy forces poured into the bay, their weapons lighting up the smoke-filled air. Instinct snapped her back into command. She shoved him behind cover and unleashed a barrage of fire, her movements sharp, each strike precise. He joined her, clumsy but fearless, his wild courage complementing her discipline. The battle was brutal. More enemies than they could count flooded the bay. The human took a blow that sent him sprawling, and she roared a sound her people had never heard from her before, as she cut through 3 foes to reach him. Dragging him back to cover, she pressed against his chest, checking his breathing. He coughed, alive but shaken, his eyes locking on hers again. "You don't give up, do you?" He rasped. She gritted her teeth, her eyes burning. "Not on you." The words startled even herself. She had never said such a thing to anyone. She had never allowed herself to feel the weight of one life above all others. Yet here she was, holding him as if he was the only thing keeping her anchored in the storm. When reinforcements finally arrived and the enemies were driven back, silence fell heavy in the bay. She sat with him against the wall, both of them catching their breath. For the first time in her life, she didn't feel like the unshakable commander. She felt like someone torn between two worlds, duty and something she didn't dare name. He leaned his head back, wincing but smiling faintly. "You're more than incredible. You're unforgettable." Her lips parted. She wanted to push him away, to remind him that war left no room for words like those. But instead, she whispered back, her voice shaking, "If you keep saying things like that, human, I will not be able to command myself. Or my heart." The sound of her own confession left her breathless. She turned her head quickly, ashamed of how exposed she felt. Yet he didn't laugh, didn't mock. He simply reached out and placed a hand gently over hers, his warmth steady and real. For a long moment, she let it stay there. The war raged on beyond the walls, but here, pressed together in exhaustion and truth, the battle within her was louder than the battle outside. And she realized something terrifying. The human wasn't just breaking her walls, he was teaching her how to feel again. The station groaned as though it were alive, its metal skeleton tearing under the constant bombardment. Fires painted the sky beyond the fractured bay doors, and the stench of burnt metal filled the air. She led what remained of her troops deeper inside, every order steady, though her heart was far from calm. The human stayed close to her side, limping but refusing to slow down. He carried no rank among her people, no authority, yet the soldiers glanced at him now with the same respect they gave her. They reached the last defense line, an observation deck converted into a barricade. Shields flickered weakly against incoming fire, and everyone knew it was only a matter of time. She stood at the front, her weapon ready, her armor scorched and cracked. He stood beside her, reloading with clumsy determination. Her cum crackled with a desperate voice, the high command demanding she hold the station at any cost. She closed her eyes for a brief second. She had been trained to obey, to sacrifice everything for victory. Yet when she opened her eyes, the first thing she saw was him, the human, watching her not with orders but with quiet trust. The battle came like a storm. Enemies flooded the deck, energy bolts raining against their shields. She fought like a force of nature, each strike a blur of silver and fire. He fought at her side, reckless but fearless, his courage filling the gaps her precision could not cover. They covered each other without speaking, moving as if they had always been meant to fight together. But the enemy numbers kept growing. One blast broke through the shields, sending soldiers crashing to the ground. She staggered but stayed on her feet. He dragged one wounded alien back behind cover, his hands slick with blood, before returning to the line. He was exhausted, yet his voice cut through the chaos. "We hold this. With you, we hold." Her chest tightened. She wanted to scream at him to fall back, to save himself, but her throat refused. Every word she tried to form collapsed under the weight of something stronger than command. She looked at him again and saw not just a reckless human, but the reason her hands still moved, the reason her heart still beat. A massive explosion tore through the barricade. Enemy warriors surged forward, their leader towering above them, armored in black and gold. He struck with brutal force, scattering her soldiers. She engaged him, their weapons clashing with sparks that lit the air. He was stronger, heavier, each strike forcing her back. The human didn't hesitate. He charged in, weapon blazing, distracting the enemy long enough for her to regain her footing. But the enemy leader swung, striking the human hard. He crashed to the floor, his weapon skidding away, blood pooling beneath him. Her scream cut through the battle. Rage consumed her, her strikes faster, fiercer, driven by something deeper than duty. She tore into the enemy leader with unrelenting fury, every blow echoing her refusal to let this human die. Finally, with a final strike, she brought him down. The enemy forces faltered, retreating under the sudden loss of their commander. Silence fell, broken only by the groans of the wounded. She dropped her weapon and rushed to him, falling to her knees beside his bleeding form. Her hands shook as she pressed against his wound, desperate to keep him alive. His eyes flickered open, weak but still holding that maddening calm. "You didn't have to," he whispered, voice faint. Her eyes burned, her throat tight. "Do not speak. Do not dare tell me what I should or should not do. You are mine to protect now." He gave a weak smile. "Sounds like a compliment." A sound escaped her lips, half a sob, half a laugh. She leaned closer, her forehead nearly touching his. Around them, her soldiers looked on in disbelief as their untouchable commander, the one who had never shown weakness, wept openly for a single human. She whispered, voice trembling but fierce, "Say it again. Say anything. Just stay alive long enough to say it again." His hand, shaking but steady, found hers. "You're unforgettable." Her heart clenched. In that moment, she realized the war had already taken everything from her once before her freedom, her tenderness, her right to feel. But now, with him bleeding in her arms, she knew she could not let it take him too. For the first time in her life, she made a choice not for duty, not for her people, but for her heart. The station was breaking apart. Fires spread unchecked, Metal beams groaned under the strain, and the cold of space crept closer with each ruptured hull. Her surviving soldiers scrambled to secure escape shuttles, but her focus never left the human lying in her arms. His breathing was shallow, his blood staining her hands, yet his eyes stayed locked on hers. She shouted for medics, her commanding voice cutting through the chaos, but none answered fast enough. In desperation, she ripped open a compartment in her armor and pulled free a vial of shimmering liquid, an emergency serum reserved only for her kind. To share it with a human was forbidden, even punishable. Yet she didn't hesitate. He weakly shook his head. "Don't waste it. Your people." She silenced him with a fierce glare, her braid falling forward as her face hovered close to his. "You are my people now." The serum glowed as she pressed it against his wound. It flared bright, searing, and he gasped in pain. Her hand gripped his tightly as the energy coursed through him, stitching torn flesh and forcing his body to heal in ways human biology wasn't built for. His breathing steadied, though he was pale and trembling. Still alive, her chest loosened for the first time since the war began. She leaned close, whispering so only he could hear. "Do not ever scare me like that again. If you do, human, I will chain you to my side so you cannot fall." He chuckled faintly despite the pain. "I'd let you, if you asked nicely." For the first time in her life, she laughed to sound raw, shaky, but real. Her soldiers, stunned into silence, watched as their unshakable commander, the warrior who had never bent to anyone, bent her heart to a single human. None dared question it. They saw the fire in her eyes and knew this bond was unbreakable. The evacuation sirens wailed. She stood, helping him to his feet, her arms steady around him. Together, they boarded the last shuttle, engines sparking as it tore away from the dying station. Through the viewport, they watched as the once mighty fortress cracked apart, consumed by fire, vanishing into the endless night. Inside the shuttle, her troops sat in silence, exhausted, broken, but alive. She sat at the front, the human resting against her shoulder. Her armor was scorched, her braid unraveled, but her eyes were steady. She had lost a battle, perhaps even the war, but she had found something greater, something no order from high command could strip away. He stirred, his voice hoarse, but soft. "You never answered me." She turned her head slightly. "Answered what?" He smiled faintly, eyes closing as fatigue overtook him. "When I said you're unforgettable." Her breath caught. She lowered her forehead against his, her whisper trembling but strong. "And you, human, are impossible. Impossible to ignore. Impossible to forget. And impossible not to love." Silence filled the shuttle. For the first time in her life, she allowed herself to feel it fully, the truth she had buried beneath armor and duty. No command, no enemy, no war could erase it now. The human's lips curved faintly into a smile as he drifted into sleep, safe in her arms. She closed her eyes, holding him close, her voice low but steady as she repeated the words he had first given her. "You look incredible when you fight." And in that moment, she knew she would fight for him, not as a commander bound by orders, but as a woman whose heart had finally been freed.